Before the start of the Great War, British shipyards had several foreign battleships under construction, the first of which was the Reshidia, the second being the ex-Rio de Janeiro, now Sultan Osman I, both being constructed for the Ottoman Empire. In that same vein, two battleships were being constructed for the Chilean Navy, the Almirante Cochrane and the Almirante Latorre. Each of these vessels was in various states of completion, ranging from the Ottoman vessels, which were virtually complete and ready to be sent on to the Ottoman Empire, along with the Almirante Latorre, which was in the late stages of fitting out. While the Almirante Cochrane was nowhere near completion, because the ship she was supposed to match and or outperform, the Sultan Osman I, was occupying Armstrong's second set of stocks until recently. In late July 1914, under the direction of the First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, the Ottoman vessels were effectively seized, not officially as we will soon see, while for the Chilean vessels, it's more apt to say requisitioned. Thus the Royal Navy received 3 additional battleships, the Agincourt, Erin, and Canada, while the Almirante Cochrane would be later completed as the aircraft carrier Eagle. In today's video, we're going to examine the battleships involved in the context to seizing the battleships. Britain, as I think we can all agree, was the preeminent naval power of the 19th and early 20th century. Their empire spanned the globe, and as such, they needed a large navy to police that empire and project power, and a large commercial fleet for trade. As a result, they had the largest shipbuilding industry, ranging from civilian ships like passenger liners or cargo vessels, to of course more militaristic vessels like battleships. Still, the shipbuilding industry did have government yards for the construction of warships. There were also shipbuilding companies like Armstrong, John Brown, Vickers, and Cammell Laird, just to name a few, all of whom were used by the government of the United Kingdom to assist in the construction of their battleships and other warships. There weren't always government requests and contracts to be handed out, and since these were companies that needed to make a profit, they might have to find other investors. And luckily for them, there were a lot of smaller nations that did not have the designers, industrial capacity, resources, and or capabilities to build and maintain such complicated vessels. In the early 1900s, British yards sold battleships or proposed ideas to nations like Japan, China, Russia, Argentina, Chile, Brazil, Greece, the Ottoman Empire, Spain, and the Netherlands. Just a few examples of the export capabilities of the yards. Those nations mentioned certainly bought smaller ships. However, they all either purchased or pursued capital ships from British yards. This led to a profitable export market of ship construction for the United Kingdom in more ways than one. Or to quote Dr. Friedman in British Battleships 1906 to 1946, "Before 1914, Britain was by far the largest naval and commercial shipbuilding nation in the world. That had 2 important consequences for the Royal Navy. First, the industrial capacity built up to service the export market created additional capacity available in an emergency. That is why the British were able to double their capital ship program in response to the 1909 naval crisis. And it is also why the Royal Navy was able to build so much new tonnage during the First World War. The second consequence was that warships under construction in British yards could be bought or taken over in a crisis." Dr. Friedman continues to describe the shipbuilding process within the United Kingdom and other services the nation and its companies could provide, writing, "In some cases, ships were designed in the United Kingdom for construction abroad. Not only was Britain the center of world shipbuilding, but it was also where many naval constructors learned their trade, at the Royal Navy School at Greenwich. Foreign students retained their habits of their youth. For example, drawings of Japanese warships designed by Hiraga, who was the chief Japanese naval constructor at the end of the First World War and up to at least 1930, bear English language as well as Japanese labels." He continues by describing the process that some of these nations would take to decide what kind of vessel they wanted constructed. A foreign navy could also solicit proposals and then meld them into a basic design. Builders would then be asked to bid on the results. Argentina set up a design office in London to produce the basic design it sought. Builders complained publicly that this 2-stage process revealed their design secrets to their rivals. Before we continue, I should also take the time to mention that these yards also exported particular parts like guns, machinery, and other critical elements for warship construction. For example, some of the Russian Empress Maria class had Parsons-geared turbines exported from John Brown, and one of the builders, the Russian Shipbuilding Joint Stock Company, requested support from Vickers. Now that we have some background to the United Kingdom's shipbuilding prowess, let's get acquainted with a couple of men who will be our main players. The first being the First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill. Churchill had been the First Lord since 1911, a post the ambitious young man took up with gusto, as the International Churchill Society puts it, where they write, Churchill adored Navy life aboard the Admiralty yacht Enchantress, and after taking up office, he set out to visit every capital ship and every Royal Navy base in the British Isles. He spent 8 months of his first 12 in office aboard the yacht. By the summer of 1914, he had held the post for 3 years, and for a majority of that, he had worked with the first Sea Lord of the Admiralty, Prince Louis of Battenberg. Although born in Austria, Prince Louis joined the Royal Navy at the age of 14 and had worked his way up to the position of First Sea Lord, with some intervention from his grandmother, Queen Victoria. Prince Louis is often described as mild-mannered and an effective administrator, good traits for the post he currently occupied. Others in the government were involved in the decision-making process, of course, but these two, Churchill and Prince Louis, were the main players in our story, although Churchill was the real brains behind the scheme. These men were dealing with a serious issue in the summer of 1914, the summer maneuvers. Taking from Robert K. Massey in Castles of Steel, Britain, Germany, in the winning of the Great War at Sea, he writes, For many years, summer maneuvers in the waters around the British Isles had been a regular feature of the Royal Navy's annual routine. In the summer of 1914, however, these maneuvers were cancelled and replaced by a test mobilization of the British Reserve Fleet. This decision had nothing to do with the developing European crisis. It stemmed from a conversation in October 1913 between Winston Churchill, the First Lord of the Admiralty, and Prince Louis of Battenberg, the First Sea Lord, in which the two men were discussing the need to save money. Churchill was under constant pressure from David Lloyd George, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and other colleagues in the Liberal cabinet to pare the enormous sums being spent on building dreadnoughts. The amount allotted to the Navy in 1914, over £50 million, would be the largest disbursement of this kind in British history. One economizing measure, only a gesture admittedly, would be to substitute a test mobilization of the Third Fleet, the Reserve Fleet, for the annual summer maneuvers. The cancellation of the maneuvers would only save a pittance, £100,000 worth of coal and oil burned, but at least the Admiralty would have made the gesture towards the Exchequer. There would be other issues on the agenda for the men of the Admiralty amongst others in government, namely Prime Minister Asquith and the Foreign Secretary Grey, as in late July, the July crisis on the European continent continued due to the assassination of the Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand, pitting the Entente powers of Russia, France, and eventually Britain against the Central Powers of Austria-Hungary, Germany, and eventually the Ottoman Empire in a general European war, amongst others. To quote Barbara W. Tuchman in her excellent book, The Guns of August, Asquith had, however, a particularly active First Lord of the Admiralty. Winston Churchill resembled the warhorse in Job who turned not back from the sword. He was the only British minister to have perfectly clear convictions of what Britain should do and to act upon it without hesitation. For a little more context to the situation Churchill was dealing with, we turn to Massey again. But on Thursday, July 23, 1914, Austria handed her ultimatum to Serbia. Early on Friday the 24th, the British Foreign Secretary, Sir Edward Grey, received the text at the Foreign Office. He described it as the most formidable document ever addressed from one state to another. Along with demands that would practically strip Serbia of its national sovereignty, it contained a 48-hour time limit for Serbian acceptance. That afternoon, when Grey informed the cabinet, members listened dutifully, but to most, the crisis seemed far away. Happily, Prime Minister Herbert Henry Asquith wrote the king that evening, "There seems to be no reason why we should be anything more than spectators." Churchill decided to let the Royal Navy continue to stand down from its war footing and return the older ships to peacetime status. Asquith and members of the cabinet promptly left the capital for the weekend. Churchill had rented a small holiday house Pear Tree Cottage at Cromer on the Norfolk coast for his wife and young children, who were already there, leaving the First Sea Lord to keep watch at the Admiralty. Churchill reached his family at the 1 o'clock train. Prince Louis did not approve of the general exodus, complaining that ministers with their weekend holidays are incredible. The next morning, Sunday the 26th, Churchill said, "I went down to the beach and played with the children. We dammed the little rivulets which trickled down to the sea as the tide went out. It was a very beautiful day. The North Sea shone and sparkled on the horizon." Twice that morning at 9 o'clock and again at noon, Churchill left the beach to walk to the house of a neighbor who owned a telephone. He called Prince Louis and learned in the first call that there were rumors that Austria might not accept Serbia's submission. At noon, the First Sea Lord told him that Vienna had declared the Serbian response unsatisfactory, had severed diplomatic relations, and had ordered the mobilization of the Austrian army. Emperor William was reported to be returning to Berlin, and the High Seas Fleet to be concentrating off the Norwegian coast. In this context, dispersing and demobilizing squadrons of the British Navy seemed a grandly wrong-headed decision. Within hours, the naval reservists would have scattered. To mobilize them again would take time, but to arrest their discharge would be politically provocative. Churchill decided to return to London immediately. In the meantime, he told Prince Louis that, as the man on the spot, he should do whatever was necessary. By the time Churchill appeared at the Admiralty that evening, Prince Louis, on his initiative, had signaled Callahan, "No ships of the First Fleet or flotillas are to leave Portland until further orders. Ships of the Second Fleet were to remain at their home ports, in proximity to the men in their crews who were in schools." Churchill immediately approved everything the First Sea Lord had done. This is when things come to a head, with Churchill returning to London. On Tuesday morning, the 27th, Churchill sent further messages to Prince Louis, as found in The World Crisis by Churchill. In this, Churchill discussed plans around the British Isles to the China station with the German East Asia Squadron. Further preparations continued as the Grand Fleet moved to Scapa Flow, and the ports and harbors were more stringently guarded, with coast watchers in place. Later in the week, Churchill looked to the various shipbuilders to further the efforts of the Admiralty, where he writes, "Our arrangements comprised an elaborate scheme for dealing with vessels under construction. In 1912, measures were taken to keep it perpetually up to date. The principle was that for the first 3 months of a war, all efforts should be concentrated on finishing ships that could be ready in the first 6 months, other vessels whose dates of completion were more remote being somewhat retarded. This ensured the greatest possible superiority in the early months and would give us time to see what kind of a war it was and how it went before dealing with more distant contingencies. The plan, of course, covered all ships building in Great Britain for foreign powers." What ships were being built in Britain at the time, you might ask? Well, let's let Churchill tell us. Of these, there were 2 battleships building for Turkey, 3 flotilla leaders for Chile, 4 destroyers for Greece, and 3 monitors for Brazil. There were also other important ships, including a Chilean and a Brazilian battleship and a Dutch cruiser, which would not be ready till much later. Important to us, of course, are the Chilean battleships and the Turkish battleships being built, as they are the most interesting ships to cover. But to backtrack a bit, what kind of battleships were these nations building, and why would they need such battleships? First, let's start with Chile. In the early 20th century, there was an arms race going on between naval powers. No, not the Anglo-German naval arms race, but the South American dreadnought race, as the powers in South America such as Brazil, Argentina, and Chile had vast natural resources and therefore wealth. These countries, having a rather contentious past, decided to spend their money on building their navies. In this, the Chilean Navy, not wanting to fall behind their neighbors, ordered 2 dreadnoughts from British yards, these being the Almirante Latorre and Almirante Cochrane. Jumping back a bit further in the arms race, in 1907, Brazil had placed orders with both Vickers and Armstrong for 2 large dreadnought-type ships, armed with 12 12-inch guns. On completion, these ships would undoubtedly be the largest and most powerfully armed vessels in South America. Chile ordered ships to match the Brazilian threat, but not until the pair were completed and similar dreadnoughts had been laid down for Argentina and America. However, Brazil, not content with just the dreadnoughts, with further technological developments, Brazil ordered the super dreadnought Rio de Janeiro, a ship we will soon discuss. Shortly after the order for the large battleship had been placed, Chile ordered 2 large battleships from Armstrong to the design of J.R. Parrott, who happened to have designed the Rio de Janeiro. The two Chilean battleships being capable of engaging any capital ship afloat. The original design called for a displacement of 27,400 tons and a main battery of 10 14-inch guns. These guns were expected to be able to match the 14 12-inch guns of the Rio de Janeiro and be able to penetrate the 9-inch side armor of the Rio de Janeiro at the correct ranges. The original design called for 24.7-inch guns as the secondary battery. This was revised as the Brazilian super dreadnought carried 6-inch guns, and therefore the Chileans would have the same. Due to the increase in weight, the design top speed dropped to 23 knots. To be fair, this wasn't too much of an issue, as the drop in speed was only about half a knot. The two ships, Almirante Latorre and Almirante Cochrane, were laid down in 1911, named for two famous admirals of the Chilean Navy. The latter was named for the quite eccentric and interesting Admiral Thomas Cochrane, who had a habit of serving in revolutionary navies while not serving in the Royal Navy throughout the 1800s. Several comparisons and distinctions can be made to Royal Navy battleships and other battleships built for foreign navies, but a distinction can be made when it comes to the main battery, as that was something unique for British yards. To take from R.A. Burt's British Battleships of World War I, he writes, "Canada was armed with the 14-inch gun, which was unique within the Royal Navy. The gun was easily on par with the British 13.5-inch. It was manufactured in much the same way, and its shooting qualities were excellent, but only 14 were produced. Of those 14, 10 were mounted in Canada, and the other 4 were kept as spares, with records showing they never saw service at sea. The secondary battery was placed further aft than in Iron Duke, although it was found the afterguns would have to be removed because of the blast from Q turret. As for armor, Canada was not protected on the same scale as British battleships. The 9-inch main belt was 3 inches thinner than in Iron Duke. It was almost entirely submerged when in deep load conditions, meaning that protection mostly relied on the 7-inch upper belt that could hardly be counted on to keep out the 11-inch and 12-inch shells fired at them by the German battle fleet or the Brazilian or Argentine ships. Work on the Almirante Latorre began almost immediately, while the Almirante Cochrane had to wait because the ship she was essentially supposed to match and or outperform, the Brazilian Rio de Janeiro, was occupying Armstrong's second set of stocks and was not scheduled to launch until late 1912 or even early 1913. Whatever the case, the Almirante Latorre was launched in 1913 and was in the late stages of fitting out in August of 1914 when the British came to inquire about purchasing the vessels as war had come. On the other hand, the Turkish vessels were two unique ships purchased for similar reasons, as their neighbors were building powerful ships, the Greeks building a dreadnought in Germany and acquiring 2 pre-dreadnoughts from the United States, while the Russians were building the Empress Maria-class dreadnoughts. The Ottoman Navy was in a bit of a revitalization, as taking from the guns of August again, Turkey at the time of Sarajevo had many enemies and no allies, because no one considered her worth an alliance. For 100 years, the Ottoman Empire, called the sick man of Europe, had been considered moribund by the hovering European powers who were waiting to fall upon the carcass. But year after year, the fabulous invalid refused to die, still grasping in decrepit hands the keys to immense possessions. Indeed, during the last 6 years, ever since the Young Turk Revolution overthrew the old Sultan, Abdul the Damned, in 1908 and established under his more amenable brother a government by the Committee of Union and Progress, Turkey had begun to be rejuvenated. With that being said, the Turkish went looking to build some new dreadnoughts, and the story of the Reşidiye began in 1911 when the Ottoman government ordered 2 battleships equal to any afloat. Provisionally named Rashad V and Rashad HMS were being ordered from Vickers and Armstrong respectively. Rashad V was laid down in the autumn of 1911, with work beginning at a somewhat slow pace. In the wake of the First Balkan War, the Ottoman Empire was forced to cancel the battleship Rashad HMS due to the financial struggles they faced. However, work on the now Reşidiye was greatly accelerated because of the need for such a ship in the Ottoman Navy. The Ottoman Navy desperately needed to be modernized as they could not compete with their neighbors, as I mentioned before. In the spirit of creating a battleship equal to any afloat, the British designers created a battleship that had similar characteristics to some of their own. R.A. Burt describes it as, basically, a shorter, beamier version of the Orion class. A big difference between the Orions and Reşidiye is the secondary battery. having a secondary battery of 6-inch guns as compared to the 4-inch guns found on the Orions. Also, her armor layout was initially thought to be inferior to other British designs, but based on the thickness and distribution of the armor, it seemed to be on par with most British battleships. Comparisons can be made to other British battleships, like that of the King George V class of 1911, having some differences like a superior 6-inch battery, and the nominal displacement being the same, but on a shorter hull. Still, a difference between these ships and the Rechidia is the main battery guns found on the ship. Although being a 13.5-inch gun, they were the Vickers Special, being classified as the Mark VI, with only 10 being manufactured, all for the ship, weighing 77 tons as compared to the Mark V at 76 tons, with the former having a tapered inner tube, but generally speaking, the guns were the same. Now, I mentioned her armor previously, and how it was on par with most British battleships, where Rechidia could be compared to the Iron Duke class and King George V class, with some comparisons and differences being, 1. The 8-inch side armor was deeper, and the 9-inch strake was shallower than in King George V. 2. The extensions to the belt, both forward and aft, were again shallower than in King George V. 3. Deck protection at the ends, outside the belt, were planned at the middle instead of the lower deck level, with the extremities of the middle deck sloping down to meet the lower deck. The ship was ready to go by the time August 1914 came around, and although the Ottomans were in dire financial straits, an opportunity arose, and they struck at the opportunity to find another ship, when the Brazilians were selling their super dreadnought being built by Armstrong. This, of course, being the Rio de Janeiro. With their vast wealth from natural resources, the Brazilian government came to Britain and other nations' naval yards with great ambitions, wanting a battleship that carried the most powerful naval guns in existence to outdo the battleships the Argentinians or the Chileans were building or planning to build at the time. In the preliminary designs, they came up with designs over 30,000 tons and ships armed with 12 14-inch guns, 10 15-inch guns, or 8 16-inch guns. All of these designs exceeded the financial means Brazil had at the time to procure such a vessel. The Brazilians chose the British yard Armstrong over stiff competition from foreign yards. They ended up deciding on a preliminary design for the basis of their ship, displacing some 31,600 tons with a main battery of 12 14-inch guns. With this, the Brazilians would certainly have the most powerful dreadnought in South America. However, the Brazilian government that decided on this design soon fell out of power, and a new one put financial restrictions on their building program so they could focus on restoring order to the country. In the process, they canceled the contract they had made with Armstrong. Now, Armstrong, wanting this contract to be fulfilled, sent out a party headed by Eustace Tennyson Danecourt, the future director of naval construction, with alternative sketches for another battleship that would be less expensive than the initial design the Brazilians had chosen. Still, this design mounted the most heavy guns ever put on a battleship until that point, with 14 12-inch guns. The Brazilian government very quickly accepted this design, and the battleship construction could get going. However, in November 1913, the Brazilian government came under more severe financial strain due to less expensive rubber from Malaya that undermined the market value of Brazil's rubber. Only 10 months after the ship's launch, with doubts if Brazil could make the payments for the battleship, she would go up for sale. The battleship was quickly bought up by the Ottoman government. The ship was renamed the Sultan Osman I. It would pair nicely with the other dreadnought being built by British yards for the Ottoman Empire, the Rechidia. These two vessels were costing the impoverished Ottoman Empire almost £6 million, with the money being raised through taxes, not paying civil servants, and finally donations from Turkish towns and villages, with women selling their hair to help pay for the battleships, making the nation rather invested in getting their hard-earned dreadnoughts. Before we continue our story with the soon-to-be Agincourt, we should discuss the particulars of the ship. She was laid down in September 1911, launched in January 1913, and completed in August 1914. She carried 14 12-inch 45 caliber guns and twin turrets along the center line of the ship, along with 26-inch guns and smaller armaments. Her machinery provided for 22 knots, and her armor was comparable to the other vessels we have discussed. Alright, I know that information wasn't exactly critical to our story, but this is a channel that mainly deals with the ships and their histories, so I thought I'd throw some of that in for you all. With these vessels being constructed, Churchill and the Admiralty looked on anxiously as the two Turkish battleships were nearing completion. The Ottomans were even more anxious to get their hands on the two new battleships. Reshidia was finished in early July, but the British Admiralty advised that she stay in the United Kingdom until Sultan Osman I could be completed, and the two battleships could head to the Ottoman Empire together. Meanwhile, the Admiralty, and more specifically Churchill, suggested to Armstrong and Vickers that there was no real need to hurry the delivery of these two vessels. However, the pressure mounted to deliver the ships, as on the 27th of July, an Ottoman passenger liner arrived in the Tyne, carrying 500 sailors for the Turkish vessels. The delivery into Turkish hands was expected on the 2nd of August, while on the 1st, the 13th 12-inch gun had been installed, and the 14th was expected later that day, but there was no ammunition aboard. Meanwhile, on the 31st of July, Winston Churchill, First Lord of the Admiralty, with war in Europe impending, informed the builders that the government intended to seize the ships, as they could not permit the ships to be handed over to a foreign power. There was a clause in the contracts that permitted the British government to buy back the ships in a national emergency, although the Ottomans were not likely to be willing to sell the ships. Armstrong feared that the Turkish captain and sailors might attempt to seize the ship and hoist the Turkish flag. So the following day, a company of soldiers with fixed bayonets marched on board, essentially seizing the ship. To quote Churchill and his reasoning for seizing the vessels, "The Turkish battleships were vital to us. With a margin of only 7 dreadnoughts, we could not afford to do without these two fine ships. Still, we could not afford to see them fall into bad hands and possibly be used against us. Had we delivered them to Turkey, they would, as the event turned out, have formed with the Goeben a hostile force which would have required a force of no less than 5 British dreadnought battleships or battle cruisers to watch them. Thus, the British numbers would have been reduced by 3 instead of being increased by 2. One of the Turkish battleships, the Reshidia, which Armstrong were building on the Tyne when the crisis began, was complete. The Turkish crew, over 500 strong, had already arrived to take her over and were lying in their steamer in the river. There seemed to be a great danger of their coming on board, brushing aside Armstrong's workmen, hoisting the Turkish flag, in which a very difficult diplomatic situation would have been created. I determined to run no risks, and on the 31st of July, I sent written instructions that adequate military guards were to be placed on board the vessel, and that in no stance was she to be boarded by the Turks. It has sometimes been made a ground for reproach against me that the requisition of these ships was one of the causes that brought Turkey into the war 3 months later." Certainly an interesting piece by Churchill. I won't delve into whether or not this action helped to bring the Ottoman Empire into the war, as that is not the point of this video. Meanwhile, for the 2 Chilean vessels that were taken into British service, as compared to the other war seizures, it is more apt to say war purchase when it comes to the Naval Canada and the Almirante Cochrane still not complete. The official handover of the vessels occurred in September. Some of Churchill's reasoning for seizing the vessels fall under Alfred Thayer Mahan's ideas in his book The Influence of Sea Power on History and how it would affect the Royal Navy's command of the sea. He feared that with such a margin, the Royal Navy would not command the strength it would need to enforce the blockade on Germany and the other commitments around the world they had to perform, notably with the ships in the Ottoman Empire. I will leave you all to debate Churchill's decision-making down below, as it's not for me to say. All of these vessels were pressed into service by the Royal Navy, with the Sultan Osman I being renamed HMS Agincourt, the Reshidia became HMS Erin, Almirante Latorre became HMS Canada, and the Almirante Cochrane was never completed as a battleship and remained in a state of suspension until launched in 1918 to be converted into a full seagoing aircraft carrier. This being the carrier Eagle. All of the battleships served throughout the Great War, with them being present at the Battle of Jutland. After the war, much like a majority of other battleships, both Agincourt and Erin were broken up. Meanwhile, Canada was resold back to Chile and continued to serve well beyond the war. While Eagle continued to serve throughout the 1920s and 30s, she served into the Second World War, being sunk in 1942. I should also mention that this video is not meant to critique Churchill or any other decision makers or the moral ramifications of the seizures of such vessels. I made it to highlight an interesting piece of history. This brings me to my final point. Let's all try to be civil in the comments. I know this is a contentious topic, but let's all try not to throw personal insults or anything like that, alright? Anyway, thank you all for watching. I hope you found the video interesting. Please remember to like and subscribe as it'll help the channel to grow. Until next time, my friends, have a great week.